record, please? Thank you.
Well, might be sorry. Reference it, but-
You have thoughts on the fiscal impacts of the expansion of the CTC and the EITC to Social Security number?
Yeah, so Patrick Tiverton, Joint Fiscal Office. Abby referenced this earlier, but yes, we would expect this to have a de minimis impact. We did get some sort of preliminary information from the tax department. On an average year, they typically get about 200 people filing with an ITIN. And that's just total people filing under that, like that way. So that's not necessarily people who would also be eligible for these credits. So, just looking at that it's a small group of people and we're taking a subset of that. So, I think we don't have enough information to give you an exact dollar figure at the moment. But we're talking about a really small group of people here, just in the ITIN world specifically right now. So yes, I would say that we would not expect this to have an outsized cost. In terms of, other states that do it this way, closest comparison to us right now is, as we mentioned, Maine, who do have this available for people with ITINs. They do have sort of a pro forma form that people fill out. To sort of get at what that is. So it is something that's done elsewhere. I can't speak for the tax department and say that's exactly how they want to do it. They probably would want to set it up in a way that's perfect for them, right? But if you want more information on how they would do it, you probably want to hear from them on that.
Okay, thanks.
Okay.
Ted, thank you so much for the incredibly short notice.
Of course. So for the record, Ted Barnett, Joint Fiscal Office. I am going to quickly, I understand there's some interest around the pass-through entity tax tax rate and credit as proposed in S45. So quickly going to run through, remind everyone of the mechanics of S45 and then talk a little bit about the different revenue impacts of changing different credit amounts. From what I understand, there's interest in both a 87.5% credit, which would be similar to Connecticut, and then also an 85% credit. So I can kind of provide some preliminary state revenue impacts on those.
That'd be great.
So this is from, let's see if I can minimize all the things on my screen. This is from a presentation that I gave in here a little bit ago. Next slide. Okay. So S45, the pass-through, it's entity tax or SALT cap workaround. You'll hear both of those terms. It creates a 7.6% entity level tax that is paid by certain types of pass-through businesses. These are our S corps and partnerships. S45 is proposed and passed by the Senate, creates a refundable 90% personal income tax credit for the pass-through entity taxes paid on personal income taxes. And then a credit would also be allowed for pass-through entity taxes paid to other states. The tax is elected. It must be elected by all members of the pass-through entity yearly, and it would be effective for tax year 2023. And so that is a type of tax. We talked in this committee before about there being two kind of levers for how this tax type would work. One is the pass-through entity tax rate. One comment I would say is that adjusting that rate has a larger, let's go back one page. So if you increase that tax rate, it results in a decreased federal liability because those pass-through entity taxes can be deducted as a business expense on federal taxes. But so it would increase both the pass-through entity tax paid by Vermonters and also the credit. And so a lot of the the state revenue impacts that could come from raising the tax rate would kind of be absorbed by the credit. and folks would get a larger personal income tax credit on their personal returns. If you were to decrease the personal income tax rate, it would result in increased federal liability because there are fewer deductible expenses on federal returns. And so you would have a decrease in the amount of PTE tax that is paid by pass-through entities and the amount of credit that is claimed. And overall, federal liabilities generally change more than Vermont liabilities as a result of pass-through entity tax rate changes. As for the tax credit, if you increase the PTE tax credit rate, that does not change federal tax liability, but it would decrease Vermont liability effectively by giving a larger credit. You're giving folks a larger kind of reduction in Vermont liability. And then a decrease in the PTE tax credit results in increased Vermont liability, so increased state revenues. So that's kind of the general overview of what's happening with this pass-through entity tax and credit. I can run through, so the estimate at 90% was $800,000 in state revenue. And I would have to go, and I'm going to stop sharing here, into our model to talk about the other two types. And it's correct that you'd like to hear about 87.5%?
Yeah, 85.
And 85.
And both sort of, if at 85, it would still be worth it if it would still be helpful to businesses and how much we might imagine the state might.
Sure. So the second part, I would have to play with a different calculator, and I could go to the side and kind of play around with that and answer that question. But I could at least answer the state revenue side impacts first. So looking at 87.5%, that's yes, this is a Excel model, and so I'm gonna not share my screen, yes.
Okay.
So that is a preliminary kind of look. 87.5% credit is $1.7 million annually in state revenue. And then I'm going to change
You said it one more time.
$1.7 million in state revenue.
More than doubles the. Yeah.
It does.
90.
Because you start going further away, I talked a little bit about these mechanics. As you start decreasing the credit, you start moving farther away from the highest marginal, like personal income tax rate. And so a 90% credit is kind of similar. You can think of it as a 10% tax in a way. And so that's relatively close to the highest marginal rate. But once you go to 87.5%, you're really moving quite a like relatively further away. So an 85% credit would be $2.5 million in state revenue.
But we're not sure if at 85, it sort of just becomes a moot point and no one would bother with it.
I think you would, I mean, it's hard to really understand take-up rates. It's from other times where I really tried to see where state revenue increases or state tax liability would start matching your decreases in federal liability. That happens at a much lower credit percentage. But this, of course, depends on people's filing status, their specific kind of tax situation. But you really have to decrease that credit quite a bit to start having federal decreases in liability start matching increases in Vermont liability. So
we have to go well below 85 to make it useless. Okay.
Yep.
Could you also remind me what the number is at 90%? Because I just.
Sure, 800,000, exactly, yes.
Thoughts? Questions?
Just out of curiosity, what if you drop it to 50%? Starts with a V.
So I will, once you start, one thing I think JFO would definitely like to communicate is once you start, this is a 3-year kind of revenue situation. And after this goes away in tax year 26, And so if you were to generate a lot of state revenue, you would be creating a budgetary hole. Start really jacking the credit
Yeah.
pretty far down.
I can see.
I could, if the rest of the committee would like to hear that number, I'm happy to do it. So, and this, I think, I'm going to refrain from providing a number because at 50% of a credit, my sense is that Vermont liabilities would increase so far that it really wouldn't be worth it to
Okay.
filers. But yes, if there were numbers closer to 80% of our credit, I think that would be where take up would still be generating revenue. You'd start on the other side of the curve.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, I see.
And just remind me, what is the low? I know there's one state that has 87. Does anybody do 85? States?
It is, Connecticut has an 87.5%,
And a half.
and they're the lowest. I do know the governor in Connecticut proposed, because of their kind of fiscal situation, changing the credit back to 93%. So that's pending, but yes, it is a possibility after the legislative session that they would increase the credit.
In light of the tenuousness of the federal, because it's due to sunset, and, I'd hate to become very reliant and expectant on that revenue when, in fact, it may collapse. And ours will sunset if the federal sunsets, so, anyway.
Would you all book any revenue from it as one-time revenue? Did you have that question?
No, I like that idea.
Sorry, could you provide as one-time revenue,
Like,
meaning?
well, when we do, when the budget side of things happen, which we don't spend time in here, right? And there's like the conversation around one-time revenue or ongoing revenue. And given that this has a very limited lifespan, because, I have no faith that the federal government's gonna act on it personally, then would it be booked as one-time revenue for the 2 years that it would be?
We would look at it as it is in current law, and under current law, it's to schedule the sunset in 2025. So we would not take it as ongoing revenue.
Okay, sure.
Yeah.
Anyone have more percentage opinions they want to share?
I talked a little bit about this, but any idea what the difference of the take-up rate would be between 87 and 87.5 and 90? We're more likely to have it taken up at 90, right? But at the same time, it's sort of, we have to make a decision, do we want to put more money in taxpayers' pockets, or do we want to try to use a little bit of that to help pay for this?
Sure. So between 87.5% and 90% credit wise, there's the amount of, so if you remember the federal, so going back to the example of someone who has $1 million, right? The federal tax savings was roughly $22,000. And so if you're talking about in that example, their Vermont liability with a 90% credit was $900. And I think, so let's see, if at 87.5, it doubles. So their Vermont liability would increase from roughly $900 to roughly, maybe $1,800, and their federal tax savings is still $22,000. My sense is that a lot of folks would still take that, but it's hard to really know take-up rates.
Okay.
I was wondering if maybe the tax commissioner come and talk about what their take-up might be, certain things.
I'm sure the tax commissioner has many things to say about this, and I'm hoping to have him come early next week to comment on all of sort of the portion of the amendment that Abby has drafted, because I'm sure
Because I
there really much to
have
say about all of it.
questions to understand it, but.
You imagine you might say something like, this is a free lunch. And I mean, I think again, given that, I think, right, 85 might not be quite as generous as 90, but if it's all a net positive for folks, I can't imagine the take-up rate would be that much different.
I guess the question is really, I mean, this is an example of someone who's got passed through income of $1 million. So for someone who's got passed through income of a lot less than that, is it really gonna make that much of a difference from them? And where in the rates are we gonna see, what's the fine line here to walk with sort of the average taxpayer?
Sure, that is a great question. And I'm gonna share my screen again because in the pass-through entity tax and SALT cap workaround issue brief that Graham did, he tried to look at who would be impacted by the SALT cap. And really, the impact starts to really show at AGIs above $200,000. And so that's when you start seeing increased take-up rates. Anything below that, folks don't have enough state and local taxes to reach that $10,000 cap. But once you start hitting AGIs of 200,000, that's when you'll start seeing participation in the tax type.
That's a much smaller base, and so then we're just not, it doesn't offer an opportunity for a huge amount of revenue.
Correct, yes. So this column here, the number of returns impacted, there's about 5,000 returns in the 200 to 300,000 AGI kind of bucket. And so that's just a really small number of filed. There are, over 300,000 returns that are filed in Vermont. And so, yes, it is a really small share.
Around 10,000 returns.
If that, yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I think just to Carl's point about, filers over 1 million, just looking at Patrick's presentation from yesterday, they're gonna raise about 57 million of the 88 million for childcare. So I don't know if I would be up for changing that 90% too much, since they're gonna get hit with $57 million in taxes.
Kind of functioning like an EITC for very well in the context of this bill. Again, mixed feelings, but like I think functionally we created sort of a
Enough to
tax
get it,
credit at
yeah.
the top and a tax credit at the bottom here.
But a much bigger tax at the top.
What?
Much bigger tax at the top.
The scales are very different in both cases, yes.
I just, back, reminding folks, as the commissioner said, this is actually a great advantage to people who have Vermont income, but who actually live out of state, would like to utilize the pass-through, or Vermonters who have businesses in a state like New York that has the pass-through and we don't. It disadvantages some folks who are in Vermont, have businesses, and it would essentially put them on the same plane as if they filed and owned only in like Mass and New York, or states that had pass-through, regardless of where we come down on the credit. I'm comfortable with 85 or 87. I was just a little nervous about the outlier, but if the whole thing goes up in smoke in 3 years, it's not going to matter anyway.
I would also just, if Connecticut does pass their change to their SALT cap, we will still be at 90%, the lowest state for the amount that is that accurate, Ted, what I just said?
I would have to see if other states have a 90%. I know that 87.5 is the lowest.
Today, and that's Connecticut.
Yes, that is correct.
They are in the process of potentially changing theirs to 93. Is that accurate?
Yes, and but I do not know, and I could definitely follow up and see if there are other states that have a 90% credit.
Okay, I think we are now, everyone keep on thinking about what percentage feels like a sweet spot, but we will have Craig in to give us his thoughts on it, and see you later.